So with the 40k balance data slate coming out shortly, let's talk a little bit about nerfs in Warhammer 40k, and maybe a few of the units and options that seem more likely targets for Games Workshop this time around. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I wanted to talk a little bit about Games Workshop swinging the nerf bat, some thoughts around the process when Games Workshop decides to tone a unit down because it's been too powerful before, and then with that in mind, think about a few units and factions that might attract Games Workshop's ire in the next balance update. At time of recording, Games Workshop's next balance data slate is expected sort of soon. When recording this, I'd guess that it'll probably be sometime next week. They usually tend to drop them sort of midweek-ish. I'd hope not literally today to make this video super outdated very fast, but who knows with Games Workshop's patterns. As ever, it'll be bringing quite a big change to Warhammer 40k with a lot of stuff expected. Changes for Core Codex Space Marines, Miracle Dice, Cold Ambush, Tempestus Aquilons, new points and more. And then throughout December will be followed with an entire content drop of one detachment a day, with lots of other options to play 40k factions. As ever with these things, a lot of things will get buffs, and that'll generally be the more feel-good area of it. So for this video I thought it would be interesting to focus on the idea of nerfing things in-game, and then a few options that maybe stand out as perhaps a little bit more likely than most at some point. Generally when I've seen the balance discussed, people usually tend to be on the side of buffing things more than nerfing things in games, so making weaker units and options get better to compete with the top stuff in a little bit more of the balance compared with the top stuff getting cut down to size. I feel like in general it's maybe a bit easier to get excited about, say, a lesser played Warhammer unit that suddenly gets good again, and you no longer have to feel bad about putting them on the table, as opposed to one of the big nasties out there getting a little bit weaker. In 40k, Games Workshop can do it with either rules or points tweaks. In general, they tend to mainly go for points if it's possible, given that that's just a little bit simpler. That means that you're not adding yet more layers of documentation and rules, which can get a little bit bloated, though occasionally rules changes do seem to be the way to go. I think I would generally agree that it's a bit more feels good and perhaps broadly better to try and buff things as opposed to nerf when it's possible. But I do stand by nerfing the top stuff being absolutely necessary if you're trying to balance a really big sprawling game like 40k. If you just have a few factions or armies that are clearly much stronger than the rest of them, it makes far more sense to tone those things down rather than buff literally every other army to try and make them the same level of overpowered. It's definitely a way that you could go, but then you'd be winding up making, say, changes to 20 factions as opposed to 2 or 3. It just doesn't really make too much sense and just leads to a whole load of power creep, perhaps feeling a bit like what we had in 9th edition, with lots of inflating AP characteristics and damage profiles. I think it often tends to be a fairly sore subject though, particularly to the people who own those models and quite enjoy them being strong and effective on the tabletop. Sometimes even if a unit is objectively a little bit overpowered, it can still be a bitter pill to swallow. Particularly, say, if within your own friend group you don't tend to win most games against your friends, even if you happen to be playing one of the on-paper stronger armies in the game, or you have a balance of forces where you have quite a lot of weak units and then just a small amount of the overpowered stuff. It can mean that your army loses a fair bit of power for something that really needed to carry weight for other random fun stuff. On the flip side though, I do feel like plenty of people in 40k at least have a fair bit of self-awareness. Maybe in tournaments and things, having a bit of common awareness that yes, this unit's a bit strong for what it really does and how much it costs, and no doubt is having a bit of time in the sun before Games Workshop hits it with the nerf bat. When thinking about some of the best things to nerf, I feel like strong stuff is kind of obvious. Maybe the absolute most clear things though tend to be the factions that are doing really quite well by the numbers, and then also include units that get taken all the time within those stronger factions. I feel like if the faction in the game is say below mid power, then you might be better off just making up strength by buffing other options in the army, as it seems that even if there are some things that are maybe a little bit too strong, they're perhaps not being so to the extent where they're causing problems. Stuff that's being taken basically all the time in stronger factions though, just feels like it's basically a no-brainer to hit, as if you raise the points or make a rules adjustment on them, then you'll both directly impact the faction strength and maybe push it back towards the mid-tier, but also help internal army balance as well, so that that single option that was being taken all the time now won't be quite so auto-include, and it might be a bit more feels good to have builds available where you both use that unit and then you don't. I think there's certainly some special characters out there in 40k that are still basically taken literally all the time. And maybe another soft sign is that if the unit's being spammed absolutely maximally in basically every single competitive list, then something's going wrong on the balance side of things. Perhaps things like Guard Bulgrin before the last balance update, or things like Eldari Fire Prisms towards the start of 10th edition when they were like 120 points or something crazy. Perhaps the slightly more complicated ones are when Games Workshop decides to nerf some things but buff lots of others to try and make up army strength. That can be a bit more complicated, as if you just nerf the strong stuff but then just buff weak stuff to the point where it's mid, you might actually take the overall power of the faction down a bit, as there's just nothing really all that standout, so it might be a little bit of a balancing act there. For the way that they're delivered, I feel like sometimes rules nerfs are better than points nerfs, but a lot of the time it's the other way around. As mentioned, if toning things down by rules, you're going to create quite a lot of bloat and wind up changing a lot of things from how it's printed in the codex, which often doesn't please people too much if you're completely rewriting a book, particularly for the negative. Though I think it definitely does have its place. If, say, there's just some janky wording that lets the units do something weird and unintended that the designers weren't thinking about, perhaps things like Tempestus Aquilon's rapid ingressing at 3 inches to block deep strike charges, or the Storm Raven being able to get unusually durable in Ironstorm Spearhead when combined with the Dark Angel's Deathshroud. It might be better to give a rules change to that as opposed to just slapping up the points on it. I feel like the Storm Raven came off second best in that. For a time it was a big staple of Ironstorm Spearhead for the Dark Angels, though I feel like just upping the points cost on the base vehicle wasn't really the right solution, as it just means it's kind of underpowered for most armies now and only gets to around about acceptable if you're using that one power combo. Finally, when you're increasing costs of units as well, you probably don't want it to go too far either. I think in 10th edition Games Workshop have broadly been quite good at mostly nerfing things with lighter touches to the point where it goes from being, say, very very strong to just somewhat usable but not outright ruined. It definitely feels a bit better in 10th edition versus some of the times in 9th when armies just got really strong, then just hit so hard that they weren't very good anymore. Though it still certainly seems to happen sometimes. I feel like a recent example will be the Orc Mega Knobs. They decided to both increase them by a massive 10 points per model from 30 to 40, and then also lower their Feel No Pain type save as well from a 4+ to a 5+, and both of those combined meant that they were only ever seen occasionally with Ghazghkull Thraka, as opposed to being a power unit in their own right. After they took a step back and dropped them back down to 35 points, they now seem to be in a good place as a solid damaged unit for certain detachments, but not auto-include anymore. Overall though, between all that, I feel like nerfs are generally kind of necessary to Warhammer 40k. If doing so, it's usually best to target the most auto-include things in the strongest factions in the game, though it's definitely still helpful enough to do for an internal balance for other armies as well. But there definitely feels like there's a lot of nuance in getting it right and making people happy, choosing between points and rules, not hitting things too hard, or just overwhelming people with changes one way or the other full stop. Before we jump into talking through a few of the stronger things that GW might nerf, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Imperium Miniatures, a gaming store based in Salisbury, Indiana, active online since 2017, and sells Warhammer miniatures at 15% off Games Workshop prices. They do the normal things you'd expect of gaming stores. They've got free shipping on orders over $100 and back orders available on request if a Games Workshop item isn't in stock. The reason they wanted to sponsor a video is to tell people about their Black Friday event. That'll have started a little while ago at the time that this one releases. A bunch of special discounts on 40k things, the chance to win a Hivestorm box on any order over $20, buy 10 get 1 free on Citadel paints, and then free shipping on any order whatsoever on the 2nd of December on Cyber Monday. In any case, hopefully it might be of use to some of you stateside. They'll be linked down in the video description if you want to check out their offers. Getting back to it though, I thought it could be interesting to talk a little bit about the units and factions that might attract nerfs and negative attention in the upcoming balance update. For armies in the game right now, 40k has a lot better balance than it often has in the past. If you look at tournament win rates, most of the armies are really quite flat. There's maybe just a couple that tends to stick up a bit more than some of the rest. It does seem that on paper, by far the most obvious choice for being reined in a bit are the Genestealer Cults, who kind of had a bit of a meteoric rise since a very badly received codex, kind of whiplash from being at the very bottom of the meta to the top. When the codex release and the points cost came out, they really weren't doing so well, and perhaps partly because of that, Games Workshop gave them actually a surprisingly massive buff in a stealthy FAQ, changing Call to Ambush, which meant that you could basically recycle units and put them right on the front lines again, which was kind of massive as it basically turned it from a mechanic that was fairly clunky and couldn't get units back into the action quite as fast as you like, to one that was a bit random but could recycle units really quite quickly and throw them straight back in the enemy's face. After that happened, their win rates recovered really quite quickly to be around about 51%, so fairly well balanced to borderline strongish in the right hands. And then Games Workshop maybe being a little bit behind the times as to how they've been doing over the last few weeks gave them really quite a big points buff, with big cuts to their battle line units, the Primus, and a whole bunch of others, now just making them all around strong, with the best win rates in the game at tournaments around about 58% or so, and for the faction's small player base, they're vastly overperforming that in terms of tournament wins, not the very most wins out there, but I believe the most wins per player attending events. They're even doing that with a whole bunch of different detachments as well, Host of Ascension, Biosantic Broodsurge and Outlander Claw, All three have really quite different playstyles and favour different units, but any which way they seem to be doing rather great. As a result, I think people would be really quite surprised if Games Workshop didn't nerf them in some sort of way, and there's certainly a fair few ways that they could make them lose a bit of power. One thing that they said in the last update is that cult ambush changes will be coming in the balanced data slate, though to my mind I'm not sure that this was really aimed to be a nerf for the faction, given that they announced it at a time when they were buffing them, and Games Workshop must have thought they were kind of weak on paper. So my guess was that that would probably be to either make the mechanic less swingy and just dependent on a few very good or very bad rolls to gain a massive amount of strength or lose it, or maybe to try and do something with the return to the board mechanic and actually make it more focused on the blip tokens as opposed to the fairly free range sort of pseudo deep strike that they have. They might well be about to kind of rewrite the mechanic in quite a big way. My guess is that they won't have quite as easy a free-form return to the board, but maybe the mechanic might be a bit more reliable after they change it. I'm really interested to see what they do with it. But either way, I think it might be better if they actually have a bit more bearing on where the blip tokens are, even if they still go down a sort of deep strike style route for it. I feel like that could be a very major way to mess with the faction's power if they wanted to. I'd hope they'd still make the mechanic interesting and fun to play with. You don't want to just completely ruin it. But otherwise, if they don't take too much power away from them from that, I guess it'd be points changes. The internal faction balance seems at least fairly good for the majority of units at the moment. As a result, I'd be tempted not to go too hard on any one unit that they have, and maybe just have multiple small nerfs to things that see a lot of play in competitive lists. Maybe a small slew of 5-point increases over a bunch of the faction perhaps. Maybe for one of the most auto-include things, perhaps the Achilles Ridge Runner might attract some attention. For the points cost, those things seem kind of godly for literally any faction that you could field them in, handing out AP debuffs, and also having kind of okay speed, damage, and defense for what they're worth. Feels like they're definitely a unit that could attract a points increase, given that they'd still be very good even if they went up a bit. Otherwise, by the tournament statistics at least, the Astra Militarum feel like the other army that really sticks out as the one that's going to attract nerfs. Their tournament win rates aren't quite as crazy as the Genestealer Cults, with around about 54% wins, though I feel like there's maybe a bit of a common talking point that Genestealer Cult players tend to maybe be a bit more expert faction players, more focused on gameplay and mechanics on average. Certainly not everyone, but a bit more of a trend that way, as opposed to guard players often being a bit more in it, because they'll stick with them through thick and thin. In any case though, either way, and even if those stats are a little bit lower than they might be due to a dilution effect, they're still looking like basically one of the top win rate armies in 40k, and they seem to be easily the single best performing faction in terms of actual number of tournament wins, 12 big ones since the balanced data slate came out, and that's massively ahead of most other factions out there. In general, it just seemed like Guard were in a great place to capitalise after a bunch of other stuff got nerfed. They took a big points increase to Bullgrins, which admittedly were one of their auto-include spammed units before, but they had lots of other good data sheets to fall back on, so didn't really lose all that much strength. Plus had some help with things like the tank commander gaining the squadron keyword, which seemed to be a strength boost to that one overall. And just a little bit before the last balance update, they also had the Tempestus Aquilons datasheet drop in, giving them a really powerful 3-inch deep strike unit for just 90 points, and I feel like that unit alone was really quite a big power game for the Imperial Guard, pretty much auto-completing certain secondaries, and beyond that just a flat-out efficient unit. As a result, perhaps the single unit that I suspect is going to take the biggest amount of fire will be those Aquilons. We'd already seen via the World Champions FAQ that they won't be able to rapid ingress at greater than 3 inches away anymore, so that had shut down their immediate charge blocking thing, which was kind of ridiculous. But even given that, I still think they're rather too strong for what they do right now. Speaking as someone who's used them in a good amount of games, they do have surprisingly savage damage output for 90 points and what their stats look like on paper. And even if they didn't, the 3-inch deep strike has just got massive amounts of value in itself, plus being able to land 10 models to move block the enemy, and also having up to 10 objective control as well, which could be kind of big for grabbing points. My guess is their points are probably going to increase to somewhere around the sort of 110 to 120 point mark. I guess something in that kind of region. There aren't too many units that have built-in 3-inch deep strike in 40k. Maybe one of the nearest analogues are Inceptors for their 130 points. They can bring a bit more destructiveness with their bolters or plasma weapons, but they don't have quite the same amount of board control or objective control. And the Aquilons do better against a whole bunch of larger infantry units, where I can certainly attest it can be rather painful for an opponent to have a bunch of Tempestus Aquilons drop out of the sky and nuke a unit on a backfield objective, or a really pricey damage dealer unit that should otherwise have been safe, and is going to feel the pain of hotshot lasguns. Either way though, I think even with those changes there'd still be a good unit. 3-inch deep strike is amazing, and Guard also have the ability to bring them back via reinforcements if the opponent actually wipes them out. So you can still basically get 2 3-inch deep strike units for the price of one pretty much. In any case, it certainly looks like the rapid ingress nerf alone wasn't enough to deter people from spamming them. There were 2 units in 2 of the top placing lists at the World Champions of Warhammer, so it seems at 90 points they're very much just happily valued for their regular 3-inch deep strike without the gamey move blocks on charges. Otherwise, for guard, if Games Workshop want to get them heading a little bit towards the mid-tier, perhaps the staple units that just would clearly still be very strong even if they had small points increases are the ones that might be most in the target, perhaps Scout Sentinels, Lord Solar, the Rogue or Dawn battle tank, perhaps something around the Scion Command Squad and Tempestus Scion combo that seems rather included in a lot of competitive lists right now. Perhaps even just a few of the slightly more played Rust variants, though likely very, very tiny, like 5-point increases if so. I'm definitely not saying all of those, and maybe just changing the Aquilons might be enough, but I feel like Games Workshop might well go after at least some of them. Of course, we know that the Guard Codex is coming out, and that's going to be coming in the Krieg launch box, but there's still actually really quite a long time until we actually get points for that, I suspect. Guard are still going to be in indexed rules till probably February or March if they follow their normal pattern, so it's still going to be worth to try and balance them before that. In general, in terms of armies that really seem to be breaking the meta more than most, it does seem to be those two. Beyond that though, I feel like a whole bunch of factions might well have units that just stick out a bit for internal balance, and certainly the ones that are a bit on the strong side in 40k right now probably have more chance than most of having certain units toned down a bit. Again, another one of the most obvious to me feels like Deathshroud Terminators. I thought it was just a kind of plain weird change where they dropped down from 120 to 110 in the last update, just because they were already a unit that were getting played competitively in Death Guard army lists, often a squad of 6 with Typhus, sometimes more. And even more so when the Blightlord Terminators are still there. Basically unplayed for the entirety of 10th edition pretty much, their selling point just being a little bit more durable than the Deathshroud, though even that's kind of borderline given the Deathshroud get their -1 to wound rule, and it just in no way makes up for the massive amount of damage that the Deathshroud can do. It does feel like a case of Games Workshop buffing the wrong Terminators there. In any case, since the points drop on those, Mortarion and a couple of other useful things, Death Guard do seem to have been having a rather good time since. Around about 53% wins or so, and plenty of events taken down. And I feel like one of the things that maybe makes it a bit more obvious that Deathshroud might be a bit of a problem is that often being spammed absolutely maximally, plenty of lists running 18 of them, which feels a bit oppressive, and some armies just won't be able to handle the stat check of that. Even if there's also lots of lists still taking them in more moderate amounts, somewhere between 6 and 12 for example. In any case, between Death Guard doing rather well and Deathshroud being quite so heavily spammed, I think it would seem at least kind of reasonable for them to go back to where they were. And beyond that, Typhus still feels like he's got kind of lucky at remaining 80 points for as long as he has. Just immense stats plus his big mortal wound attack just quite clearly seems to be worth a bit more than that. I think small increases to the tune of 10 points or so wouldn't hurt either unit, though I would say for Death Guard I think it should probably be balanced out by Blightlord Terminators actually getting a roll again. Maybe something like a rules change to either make them objectively more damaging or more durable. It is kind of telling that they're already, I think, the single cheapest Terminator in the game, but still not getting played at all. Another option that I thought was kind of lucky to make it out unscathed at the last balance pass was the Great Unclean One. Not so much the base Great Unclean One, though he is still fairly strong, but more so the enhancement version where you pay 30 points to get him a permanent 4+ feel no pain save all game. That feels like they're about the best 30 points you'd ever spend with durability in 40k for anything, and as a result, on average rolling with the feel no pains, you'd have to chew through around about 40 wounds at toughness 12 with a 4+ invulnerable save, all for 260 points if you wanted to kill the thing, just more durability than most armies can reasonably handle, while also dealing with the other greater demons no doubt bearing down on them. His damage isn't exactly huge, but he can still handle medium infantry pretty well, plus he has his other support like Boss for Nurgle Demons and the Shadow of Chaos aura. Plus debuffing an enemy's toughness as well is actually a surprisingly good thing. I think the most telling thing is that it's just kind of auto-include in basically every Chaos Demon's army. If they're going to keep the Shadow of Chaos the way it is, probably that enhancement should cost more, if they don't want him to basically always be an auto-include. Another one that feels maybe in a bit of a weird place for internal faction balance is the Doomsday Ark. Like the Deathshroud, this was a weird one that went down by 10 points in the last update, when I feel like it probably should have just stayed as is. Necrons again are doing kind of fine, sort of balanced win rates, but winning more tournaments versus their peers. I feel like this one's maybe a little bit more internal balance between the heavy support stuff, but it certainly wasn't helped too much by this thing dropping down a bit. I feel like after the Necron Codex came out, things like the Locust Heavy Destroyers, Doomstalkers and the Doomsday Ark all had their roles and were in relatively good balance. Then the Doomstalkers got increased to 145 points to hit Canoptek Court. That's probably been too successful to the point where that's kind of weak now and they could probably afford to drop. And then since then, people were generally running more either the Heavy Destroyers or the Doomsday Ark. Fairly good arguments to be made for both of them. But then at the last one, Games Workshop dropped down the Doomsday Ark from 200 to 190, and the Locust Heavies went up from 50 to 55. It just feels like the balance has been tipped a bit there, where if you're taking heavy fire support, you're taking Doomsday Arks and not the heavy destroyers. I feel like this one's again one that they could just revert it back to where it was, and possibly the same for the Locust Heavies, and perhaps if there's one more thing that could go up for Necrons, perhaps the Catan Shard of the Nightbringer could have a target. Again, I really don't think he'd need all that much, but he just seems to be taking quite a lot more than his counterpart Catan, all of them being big fancy and dangerous stacks of stats. Finally, and maybe a slightly more out there one in terms of trying to even up a faction for internal balance, maybe the Dog Karnivores for the Chaos Knights could bear a small points increase, but with the heavy proviso that only if they manage to make the Titanic Knights equally strong as the Carnivores, and change the status quo completely from how it's normally Dog spam plus maybe one of the things, or more often not at all and just add in some allied demons instead. That's quite a big ask and probably kind of hard to imagine for Chaos Knight players, given that it hasn't really happened since the faction had its codex come out in 9th, and if they didn't manage to do that, it's probably best just to leave them as is, as they're looking kind of well balanced at the moment in game. Tournament win rates are around about 49% or so, and they have been managing to rustle up some event wins as well. By the numbers, they don't look like they're a faction that's struggling too badly. I do feel like there's points values where the big knights will get strong enough and will be eventually better than the war dogs, though I'm not sure whether or not it's best to do that or give them some sort of rules boost in the interim before their codex comes out. Either way could potentially work, but I feel like it's been a hope for Chaos Knight players to have them be the centre of the army each time an update's come out, and if that did manage to happen, I feel like the Carnivores could afford to increase a bit. Currently it's basically them and the Brigands carrying the entire faction's strength. Early on in 10th edition, Carnivores with their big melee stats were still seeing play. I believe their points cost was over 150. They still seem to be kind of viable at that level, just to have one or two extremely savage melee threats to punish the enemy if they pushed forward too much, and reach out and do far longer charges than you might expect. If a bunch of the other Chaos Knights got stronger and then they went up to something like 150 again, I feel like we'd still see them for that intended role, rather than being spammed for 4 to 6 in a list. But again, probably best to leave them as is, unless they do genuinely know that they're going to actually make the big knights viable. In any case, look forward to hearing your thoughts on nerfs in Warhammer 40k. What do you think is the best approach to balance toning down the strongest things in the game and buffing the weakest? And which are the things that are most in the crosshairs for Games Workshop with the upcoming balance update? In any case, a big thank you to Imperium Miniatures for sponsoring this video. Feel free to check out their Black Friday sales linked in the video description. But otherwise, a big thank you for listening. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly be looking forward to covering the balance data slate in full once we get it. Feel free to check out the things down in the video description, including the Patreon page if you'd like to support the channel. But otherwise, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.